So hi everyone, I'm here with Harrison Goode. He works for Edge Tech, one of the co-founders, and they're recruiters in the RPA, AI, intelligence and machine learning environment. So Harrison, thanks very much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
That's all right. Thanks for having me on, Chris. Great to meet you.
One of the things I wanted to chat a little bit about is what's going on in the market, and obviously we've had been through quite a lot of change over the last couple of years. And so, how are you seeing the employment market sort of today, and what's sort of been the dynamics of what's changed, and then where does it currently sit as we sit here today?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess we kind of classify ourselves as almost like an emerging technology recruitment business. So, we work on a lot of new and exciting technologies that are coming through to market. Typically, technologies where the skills for those, technologies in particular are quite hard to find. That's where we do our best work. And I think over the past couple of years, it has changed drastically. Obviously, COVID has been a massive impact to that, and I know it's probably being talked to death quite a bit, but coming out the other side of COVID, where the skills were already sort of in demand, I think COVID has pushed a lot of organisations to really look inwardly at their organisations and actually realise, we're probably not that digital. A lot of people working from home. We've got a lot of things that we were doing which were probably considered old school, and it's really, forced those businesses to adopt change quite quickly, and usually with that comes a lot of these new technologies. So one in particular, robotic process automation, is and has been a very hot topic for the past few years, and we've seen a massive increase in demand from our side. So in the UK, we work in Europe and we work into the US as well, and globally the demand for these professionals has increased tenfold. And I think the availability for those skills hasn't increased alongside that as well. So there's more of a war on talent, as we call it, for those types of individuals. So yeah, it's still very much in demand, and we can't see that changing over the next 5 years, at least anyway, from what we predict.
Yeah, and if you look at the emerging technologies, I suppose you've got AI or machine learning. There's decision science that's out there. I suppose RPA was another one. I mean, of those, which one's is the largest sector? Is that RPA is probably the dominant piece, which talks to, I suppose, process automation in the short term?
Yes, yeah. So I would say, yeah, you're right. RPA is probably the most popular. I think for a lot of organizations, RPA is usually the gateway technology which opens doors for all of the other technologies that surround that. So, once a lot of organizations have automated the straightforward rules-based processes, they then look at other areas that they can automate or become more efficient or increase, cost savings across their businesses. And then that sort of bleeds into, the machine learning elements, the unstructured data piece, document processing, OCR, things like that. And yeah, it almost, pushes businesses down that route, and then opens up so many other doors for, for areas of improvement and other technologies alongside that as well. So yeah.
And what about if we take like an industry cut? I mean, are there some industries that you think are further ahead, in terms, at least from a recruitment point of view, in terms of because you're at the front end of sort of seeing where people are really investing in this stuff? I mean, are there some industries that are further ahead than others, do you think?
Yeah, I think we saw, naturally, financial services, they're always a big one. And I think, because they've got a lot of money, a lot of capital, they're quite often the early adopters of these technologies. Alongside that, there's obviously a lot of compliance and, regulations that come with the work that they do, sensitive data and things like that. So I think those types of organizations are probably the furthest along. Across the enterprise, a lot of businesses are adopting, but I think they were the early adopters, and we're really starting to see that trickle through into other sectors and industries now. So things like retail or manufacturing, healthcare is obviously a big one. I think COVID has kind of forced their hand a little bit with that, and the increase in demand from that side. So we are seeing it quite a lot, even into sectors such as like hospitality nowadays as well. I know quite a bit of a hit, but now we're starting to see them kind of rebound and come back. So it is across, but yeah, I think financial services, banking, insurance are typically the kind of early adopters to this.
Yeah, I suppose anywhere where there's data, then you're gonna find the technologies in terms of like trying to digitalize it and understand it to a certain extent.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And what about remote working? So we hear a lot about sort of remote working, and sort of a lot of us have been working remotely for the last few years. And do we go back to the office or not, or hybrid, or those kind of things? And how are you seeing that on the ground in terms of what employers are looking for, but then also what kind of prospective employees or candidates are really looking for as well? Is there a tension there, or is that sort of like landing somewhere, do you think?
I think we'll find ourselves somewhere in the middle. But I think from an employer's perspective, a lot of those businesses had to adapt anyway. They were forced to adapt to have people remotely. I think we're starting to see now things that are slowly returning back to normal. I think we're starting to see these organisations perhaps want people back in the office maybe once a week.
Yeah.
Not really more often than that, to be honest. That might change as things progress forward, but I think you have to remember a lot of these businesses have large offices. It used to be a big selling point for for us, for instance. We're proposing a new opportunity to a candidate, you'd talk about the organization, but one of the big talking points used to be they have a big swanky office in London. They've got a ping pong table and a slide and bean bags in the office, and fruit bowls and free tea and coffee, but that's not even a consideration anymore. And that kind of on the sort of candidate side of things, it kind of goes against what people are looking for now. And in the candidate market, their requirements have changed quite a lot. People are now looking at remote first roles. They're much more interested in that work-life balance, that flexibility to work from anywhere, given whatever hours they want, to as long as they hit the targets that they've been and all the certain requirements, that's kind of what they're looking for. So in the candidate market, it has changed in terms of what people are looking for from that perspective as well.
And does that change by maybe skill set, or even, so I suppose, other demographics like age or where people are in the country or anything like that? Is there a sort of like a skill set? It's almost like in financial services, you'd have almost like this idea of like, well, if you want to insist they're in a certain location, then it sort of restricts your pool, so you can't actually get the best people, and the best people sort of they look for working anywhere.
Yes, yeah. So I think there is a generation thing. I think a lot of younger people now expect to almost work completely remotely and not need to be in the office whatsoever. I think the slightly older generation are okay with being back in the office. And because they have been in the office previously, I do think they miss that sort of interaction. But I think with the younger generation who perhaps, are in their first or second role, perhaps not having been in an office environment, sometimes I think they almost don't know what they're missing. But at the same time, it does really open up that talent pool for employers. So whereas before, if we were working for a business, for instance in London, looking for an RPA developer, we'd search within a sort of a commutable radius within their being in the office 3-4 times a week, maybe even 5 days a week. So you'd have to find someone within quite a tight location where the skills for that certain position are already quite niche. But now for organizations that have said this person can work completely remote from wherever, they need to be in the UK, but they can be anywhere. Just opens up that talent pool 100-fold for that organization. You can find people a lot easier, perhaps even at a slightly lower price point. For instance, someone up north, cost of living up there is slightly less than someone in London, so they wouldn't need as much. And the skills are, very much the same. So it allows these organizations to still attract really good talent, perhaps, for, a cheaper cost base for them, and, still get the job done. And we see the quality is still there. There have been some questions raised around, the level of quality. And I think that probably lends itself more to junior positions. I think more senior people in these types of positions are trusted to, go ahead and get on with what you're doing. What you're doing, hit the ground running. So that's kind of a big thing as well.
Do you think it's going to affect things like London waiting? Because that always used to be a thing where you used to get, there used to be higher pay if you actually worked in London and one of the big cities. And a lot of people sort of moved out from one of the big cities into much more rural locations. And I suppose the certain amount of danger or fear that they're going to be asked to move back again. But do you think it's going to affect those kind of dynamics in terms of like, potentially salaries in cities or some of those dynamics?
I do, and I think what we've seen a lot of people move out from the big cities, like you say, moving to rural locations, perhaps areas of lower cost of living to maximize their income. But what we've seen in the spaces that we work into, we've seen the salaries kind of flatten out a little bit. We saw, the bigger cities used to pay a little bit more, but now everyone's working remotely. It's brought the overall sort of salaries down for these types of positions. So even for people who are living in London, there's almost an excuse for them not to expect more, because the employer could technically find someone, 30, 50 miles away at a slightly cheaper price point because they don't London. So we have seen that sort of flatten out a little bit, and I think it's good for the market, because it allows these organisations to gain access to the skills that they wouldn't have access before, and like I say, a slightly lower price point as well. Although we haven't seen it drop a huge amount, we've just seen it sort of flatten out really. So
yeah. And what about international opportunities? I mean, are you seeing more sort of like internationally, and in either people looking for people in the UK for overseas roles, or vice versa, where you're having to source people in different geographies? I mean, how much of a restriction do you think that is?
Yeah, I think again that's opened up a lot of people's eyes to working completely remotely. So whereas before, people wanted their employees to be onshore or near the office to be able to get in, but because everyone's working remotely anyway, a lot of organisations have said, well, do they really need to be in the UK? Could they actually be in Poland? Could they be in Germany? Could they be in other perhaps lower cost locations where the skills are just as good and they're even cheaper? And obviously there's the control element, whether you have complete oversight on the work, but if you've got a good internal process to measure and sort of manage that, then there shouldn't really be a question. I think a lot of businesses have really taken advantage of that and seen some really good results.
The fintech world, I imagine you interact fairly heavily with a lot of the fintech world. I mean, how do you sort of see that developing, I suppose, particularly in the UK, but also I suppose in Europe? I mean, are there themes in terms of where that's sort of growing? And obviously working closely with the collections and financial services space, and definitely there's some rumblings around what's going to happen with affordability shock. Will that affect investment going forward? Will that affect the way people actually pay their accounts going forward? And so it feels like it's kind of up in the air. But I mean, how are you sort of seeing that sort of developing as we sort of go forward into the back end of the year? Any impacts?
From what we've seen so far, not a great deal. I think if anything, we've seen probably quite an uptick in those financial organisations adopting these technologies, because I think they know that the change is coming and that things are obviously, like you say, the rumblings are kind of taking place at the moment. So I think there are a majority of organisations that are doubling down on their tech efforts. So we've seen quite a lot, not just around RPA, but other machine learning, perhaps data science skills that are being required. It seems that there hasn't been a slowdown. There's probably been an increase in the demand, and I think that will continue until something actually happens. It's hard to say, because they usually work right up until those deadlines, and then when something happens, it's almost instantaneous, sort of overnight, where either cuts would happen or things would take place. But I think in these organizations, I think the technology teams that work within these businesses are usually quite safe in a way, because if the organization has adopted or invested in these technologies, a lot of the time they want to see it through, and there's usually an ROI attached to that at the back end. So I think if they've already made those plans to invest, then I think they want to see that outcome no matter what happens. So it's quite hard to predict, but
I suppose to a certain extent there's a certain amount of sort of like investing in digital now, because that gives you extra capacity for your processes later on. Or do you invest in your product development now because that gives you something to sell later on, and it might actually become more expensive later on down the road?
Yes, we've seen that, and I think that is why people are investing as much as they can now. And I think because these technologies are or have been proven over the past couple of years, I think the stigma around robots taking your jobs, or the ROI that some organizations promise these businesses can seem a bit smoke and mirrors at the start. But I think now that a lot of businesses have seen some significant ROI, a lot of people are kind of down and saying, right, we need to adopt this, other people are starting to do this now, we need to be doing it as well. And that kind of increases because of that, I think. So it'll be interesting to see. But I think the way that businesses go about attracting the talent is also something that probably needs to change as well. So, yeah.
So we were chatting a little bit earlier around inflation, and you mentioned a little bit around like the supply of people for these roles as well. I mean, are you seeing that because of the lack of supply, because of the investment that's out there, that's sort of driving up potentially wages, which is a great thing from a candidate point of view. But although it might be tough from a business point of view. I mean, are you seeing sort of changes in salary levels as a result of supply and demand, or inflation that's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's always quite a hard pill to swallow when you do put for instance, let's just use an RPA developer for example, who's got 2 years RPA development experience, which is considered, a midweight developer, relatively experienced, and then you next to another developer who's been doing a certain technology for 10, 15 years, but that RPA developer is asking for 10 or 15,000 pounds more, purely on the basis that the demand is there. There are probably 5 or 6 other organizations that would willingly pay them that drop of a hat. So it is pushing it up, and like I said, I think when we were speaking before around the people coming to market with these skills, it is slow, and we'd like to see more in higher education around this, because there's not a great deal currently, and there are AI and computer science degrees that people are going into, but I think probably more needs to be done before higher education to push people into these routes. We're doing quite a lot from our perspective, actually, around local schools in our area, doing talks to a lot of the students, and basically educating them on what can be done, what are the hot areas that we see at the moment. I think that a lot of them would open their eyes to to IT and technology, and how the future is very much focused around technology and development and these solutions that are being adopted by businesses. It's a very safe bet career wise if someone was to go down that path. So yeah, the demand is definitely outstripping the supply.
And if you say there were a couple of pointed questions, if there are top 5 technologies to learn, if you wanted to get into it, what would you say that where would you put your money? Where are other people putting the money, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say RPA is a big one. So robotic process automation. There's a number of different tools out there, but I think if you have a good general idea around what RPA is and what it can do for organizations, there's always going to be a demand there. We see that demand quite a lot at enterprise level at the moment, but it is starting to trickle down into small, medium enterprises, and will eventually into smaller businesses. I think data science is another big thing that people should get into, or data visualization and things like that. Python is another, I guess, a technology that we would probably recommend, because it underpins a lot of these technologies. So if you have a good understanding of that could open up a lot of doors into various routes. I think another thing possibly is more around machine learning and machine algorithms. And I guess that lends itself a little bit to mathematics and statistics. So I think down that route as a sort of separate spin-off to that as well could then eventually open doors into those types of opportunities as well. So I guess that's 4 in a way, but those are probably the top ones that we see quite a lot of, but also that could allow you to go into different areas. You're not sort of pigeonholing yourself into sort of one route. For instance, if you wanted to be a doctor, that's fine, but studying to be a doctor, that's the route you'd go down. But doing something like that, like a data science or machine learning or statistical analysis, that could open up a lot of doors into various technologies as well.
And what about particular packages? I mean, do people request for specific packages or specific technologies? I mean, is there a sort of like a top list that you would say that these are the ones that are probably most popular in terms of your requested to recruit for?
Yeah, I think RPA is obviously a big thing. I think the broader term intelligent automation is the overall package that a lot of organizations are looking at the moment, and it often starts with RPA. but there are other intelligent.
But even within that, I suppose there's providers, right? So back in the old days, you'd look at, I don't know, SAS programmers, or you'd look at, now it's little R programmers, or those kind of things. I mean, there's specific packages or vendors that people need to experience, or is it just much more general? You know, we just need an RPA expert.
Yeah, I would say certainly for RPA, there are probably 3 or well 4 now. So there's UiPath, who are very much leading the way in the space at the moment. We've got an organization called Blue Prism and their package and their tool. Automation Anywhere are another, and then finally, who I think will really disrupt the space, Microsoft and their Power Automate platform as part of their Power Platform and Power Apps. But Power itself, more specifically around RPA, is really going to disrupt the space. I mean, Microsoft acquired an RPA vendor in 2020, and they've started integrating that into their platform. So, and you know, Microsoft are clearly a giant business, so you know, they can really disrupt the space if they want to, and I think they will catch up in terms of, you know, the technology and its functionality over the next couple of years. So they're probably the main 4 in the RPA world, at least anyway, that we would say to, you know, hedge your bets against.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly seen that on the data visualization side with like Power BI. I mean, where that's come from and where it's gone to in such a short period of time, in terms of like, I mean, Microsoft have got quite a huge financial muscle and backing behind them to really sort of like catch up, haven't they?
Yeah, and I think the vendors that are already operating in the RPA space, I think they're probably a little bit worried around, you know, what will happen with Microsoft. Obviously, the other vendors have had a very good start. You know, they've got some big clients. They've had some, you know, some really big wins, seen some great ROI. But we've only recently seen Blue Prism being acquired, so they've been sort of swallowed up. Could that happen to UiPath? Could it happen to Automation Anywhere as well? Could that consolidate more? We might just see, you know, maybe a UiPath and perhaps just a Microsoft in the market. So yeah, it will be interesting over the next sort of 5 years. I think we'll see some interesting changes, but it's still early days, I think, at the moment.
So the latest theme that's sort of been talked about, I suppose, being run in the media is Metaverse or Metaverse. Have you seen anything around that yet, or is that sort of like, is that still sort of in the in the branding and the marketing side of things, rather than the actual sort of like, here's where the rubber hits the road?
Yeah, I think you're right. It is still very much the softer marketing perspective from it at the moment. I think the commercial and business applications for that are still yet to be proven, and I'm sure there's a few use cases for it, but from what we see, it is a softer play that a lot of organizations are entering into at the moment, and I think there's a lot of opportunity moving forward, certainly from a recruitment perspective. I think, you know, with everything being done virtually at the moment, I think, you know, there probably will become a point where you'll be able to go into the metaverse and, you know, interview with someone with your own go into a virtual meeting room, you know, with your Oculus or, you know, your headset on, and meet with the team and do certain things or do certain tasks within that metaverse as well. So you could even include like a technical test if someone was a developer, to prove their capability within that. So I think there's some interesting applications, but I think at the moment it's still quite early, and I think it will take a bit of time for those businesses to really put something into play.
Yeah, you have seen some of the banks in the news starting to set up teams, almost like that ideation stage. But I'm also thinking about all of us who spend like time at home building wireframe models and all the stuff you do on the games and those kind of things. I mean, all of those skills that you sort of like you learn when you're younger are the skills that are probably going to be in demand, it feels like, in like 5 years time or 10 years time. And the people who've done it when they were kids probably are the ones who are probably going to know it, right?
Yes, yeah, definitely, and I've got no doubt that it will be really big. I think the sort of commercial application for it at the moment is still not quite there, but it's great for the marketing and the exposure, and you know, for a lot of organisations that are adopting it, I think it's good. So yeah, again, that's another one to probably watch. We're not seeing a huge amount of it just yet, but we have done some recruitment for, you know, augmented reality or VR, AI sort of experts. We're seeing a massive increase in those types of skills and the demand, and it's also an area that we see a lot of people are wanting to get into as well, because it's almost as sexy and interesting, because you get to sort of play around with your headsets and build metaverses or certain rooms and programs and things like that. So obviously you can see how attractive it is to to young people coming up in the space.
Yeah. And how have you found working remotely? So the irony of this conversation is that of all of the people I've interviewed, I interview people all over the world. We're probably sitting as close to each other as any of the people I've ever interviewed, actually, really. So just around the corner in some ways. But I mean, how do you find working remotely? And I mean, even the fact that we're still doing it remotely is kind of interesting in some ways.
Yes, yeah. So I think it's great. As a recruiter, we've always worked across various locations, into the US, into other areas. Obviously, our role is very phone and video based and emails. So technically, we could work from anywhere. I think the biggest impact that we saw right at the start, when everyone was working remotely, were organisations trying to get their head around offering someone a job that they'd never physically met. And a lot of these businesses in the past, has done 3 or 4 interviews where they've met face to face and then, offer the person the job. For the first few months when we went into lockdown and we were all working remotely, the organisations we were working with were really trying to scratch their heads to figure out, well, how are we going to interview, or how are we going to offer them the job? Can we offer people just over video that we've never actually physically met? How can we trust them? So there's been a lot of changes, and I think for the better, because I was talking to a candidate the other day who was, who's based in Scotland, interviewing for a client based in London, and we were talking about the interviews that have taken place. Very quick 2-stage interview process with a video, and we were saying, prior to us working remotely, you would have had to go into the office a minimum of time to meet everyone. So that's a trip from Scotland down to London. It's not a short journey. In the same time, you've got to take, probably a day out of your day where you're currently working at the moment to go to an interview for a job that you might not get. And then, you come back down again. So it's a lot of commitment from the candidates. So even though the candidates are still committed to, the roles of the interviews, they don't have to sacrifice as much within their current job. And I think that's actually opened up doors for other candidates that may have said no or turned things down previously because, they didn't want to take 2 days off of work to go and interview a company to maybe get offered the role. Whereas now they can, take their lunch break, have the interview over lunch, or maybe in the morning or in the evening, and disrupt their sort of working day as well. So I think it's really changed things for the better. I hope things will continue like that. I think there should, and perhaps in some cases, should still be a personal, perhaps face-to-face element, certainly at a senior level, I think, for some hires. But where it's not possible, I think, a lot of businesses now are just completely fine with the fact that they can offer someone a job over video, and that would be fine. So,
I mean, in the US and North America in particular, it's termed the Great Resignation, with a lot of this sort of churn that's going on. Do you think some of that's related to the fact that people can interview over lunchtime with remote working, or do you think some of it's just no one moved anywhere for the last sort of 2 years, and so now there's pent up demand because people naturally want to have a new role?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the two, and I think people are really starting to realise their worth. And I think a lot of people before were really tied to their job and felt really committed, but I think now people have realised that whoever you work for, that can be transactional. Your own personal being and your happiness is by far more important, and your employer is more of a transactional thing now than it ever has been. I think we always have the conversation internally. You see someone within a role for 3 to 4 years, that's considered good longevity nowadays. I think the average time in a role is 18 months now, I think, before people decide to move on. So I think the way that people work now, and it has changed greatly, but I think because people have realized that they can work for anyone, work from anywhere, and their requirements are more important, people are more happy to say no. When they do become unhappy, they know, I'm going to interview somewhere else and I'll find another job. Whereas before, a lot of people would probably just suck it up and just, I hate my job and I'll stay at my job for another sort of 5 years and then we'll see what happens, and nothing ever changes. And I think it's changed for the better, because I think organizations now have realized that they need to treat people a bit better. Not that, you know, they were treated badly before, but I think, you know, your employees are the gold that, you know, that runs the business, and you need to look after them to ensure that, you know, you're going to be successful business. So you need to do everything in your power to, you know, to make sure that they're happy. On the other side, I do think there is, on some occasions, maybe a greater expectation from, you know, from the candidate community to expect more than they probably should. You know, I want a 2-hour working day where I can work wherever I want, and unlimited holidays, and I want, you know, a really good pension plan, or, you know, unlimited, you know, life insurance for my family, and all this sort of stuff. So I think there does need to be a line drawn, but I think we're getting closer to a better sort of balance from there. So yeah.
And I suppose this might sound like a strange question to ask someone in the recruitment business, but if you're looking at people are looking for a new job, what's the reason why people don't take it? I mean, so if I'm working as a company, what's the reason why? How do I get people to stay and not take jobs? Because obviously the market's sort of buoyant. I mean, what do you think is the biggest draw for people to stay where they are rather than taking a new role?
I think it's just familiarity and comfort.
Yeah.
You know, something that's familiar, something that's easy. They've done it before. They know everyone. If they do, and they have an offer, and they get counter offered by their, you know, by their employer, but, you know, I will give you an extra £5,000 more a year. Okay, why wouldn't I stay? I don't have to move anywhere. I don't have to get onboarded. I don't have to do all of this. But in reality, I think there's a scary statistic. I think it's 90% of people who do accept a counter offer end up leaving within the next 6 months anyway.
Yeah.
So, and we see it all the time. People who do say, "Oh no, I'm going to stay," they come back to us within the next, you know, sort of 6 months and say, "I made a bad choice. Nothing's changed in my current job. The reasons why I was originally looking to leave haven't changed.
Yeah.
So I'd like to move again." But it is hard for organisations to try and keep people at that stage, because their mind is already made up at that point. So it really starts before that even happens. So I think retention for a lot of businesses is something that's often missed. I think a lot of organizations really focus on what can we do to attract the people, and then when we get them, great, we've got them now, we'll set them on their tasks, they'll be doing the work, but what are you doing to sort of incentivize them to stay? You know, what's the sort of culture like? Are you having, you know, regular reviews, whether that be performance or other things as well? You know, make sure that people are really happy, because I think once people are onboarded, they're often almost forgotten about at a certain stage, when really those are the ones that you want to be, you know, championing within your business and keeping as long as you can. So yeah, it's a tricky one. There's no exact sort of science to keeping people, but it does start way before they've even sort of considered looking at other opportunities. So
and I suppose the other side to that question is, sorry, if I'm looking for a new role and people around me have sort of been finding new roles, and I don't feel maybe that I'm plugged in enough, and or they're not coming towards me in terms of, like, I'm not getting contacted by them, what are the best tips to sort of put yourself out there and maybe find some of the opportunities that everyone else is looking at in what apparently seems like a completely buoyant market?
yes, so I would say one of the main things would be LinkedIn. So something as simple as making sure that your LinkedIn page is up to date. There's options on there to set yourself as open to opportunities that not everyone will see on LinkedIn, but recruiters with a specific LinkedIn recruiter license will be able to see as a filter. And just being active and going on there, looking at job opportunities, perhaps applying for certain things, looking at recruiters within the space that you work into, reaching out to them. They might not have something immediately, but if you register your interest and share your details with them, if something comes up, then you're sort of on their books, and they can keep posted. They might have monthly newsletters or emails that kind of go out with hot jobs and things like that. So I think that would be a good starting point for people who are, you know, interested to hearing about new things. I think in the spaces that we work into, a lot of the candidates we speak to are bombarded weekly or even daily by recruiters or even companies about opportunities. I even receive messages myself, and I'm not an RPA developer, but I occasionally get jobs about RPA roles. So yeah, there's that would probably be one of the main things. It's such a big platform at the moment. It's a place where you know, a lot of people go to look for potential talent, and you know, there's a lot of recruiters on there, and you know, a lot of opportunity, and there's ways you can interact with people and connect and things like that. So I think that's a good starting point for someone, at least anyway. If you don't want to be super proactive and put your CV on the job board, for instance, but you want to do something a bit softer, that's probably the best way to start.
Yeah. Okay. Well, fantastic. Well, Harrison, thanks very much for making the time today. I really appreciate it. Some really fantastic insight there, particularly in that sector. I think I'm going to get my CV brushed up with RPA and start doing some courses. I think from both of what you said. So
definitely, yeah.